Yeah.
The question is, this House to no adjourn. Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I thank members who are staying back for this debate? I recognise it's very late in the morning, but it is appreciated because it's an important debate that affects many people far more than we would want. And ideally, we wouldn't be having this debate again. We would hope by now that the government would have listened to the calls for the programme to be paused, to learn the lessons, to take stock of where we are, and hopefully to fix a system that ought to be providing a decent service to people, simplifying the benefit system. After the Great War, William Beveridge declared that there were 5 giants on the road to reconstruction: poverty, disease, ignorance, squalor and idleness. To tackle these 5 giants, a new radical response was needed, a response big enough to meet head-on the challenges of the day and the challenges that risk Britain's future. More than that, it set a vision for a new settlement between the rights of citizens, the role of government and the formation and the foundation of public services. It was a balance of roles and responsibilities, rights and obligations, and that for Britain to succeed, that an investment was needed in its foundations. And the challenges facing Britain today, though different, are as big. Our economy is weak and reliant on low wages, low skills, insecure employment. Now, we might sweeten the bitter reality by making it sound cutting edge. Let's call it the gig economy instead of exploitation. Or by affixing power to the worker, when in fact many of them are powerless. But at its heart, it's a weak foundation of exploitation, low value, and one which fails to respect a very basic belief that I was raised on: a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. And why is this important? It's important because people should have the ability to earn enough to live, not just to get by, but to be comfortable, to live life, to be able to have a nice meal, a holiday, a reliable car, a decent, secure home, a healthy family, and crucially, a country which invests to ensure that the next generation does even better than the one that went before. A society where fairness runs through everything we do, the balance of contribution, but with equal dividends for those who play their fair share.
May I intervene?
Absolutely.
Does my honourable friend agree with me that the new sanctions in the universal credit system punish the working poor, especially low-paid workers?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, the evidence says that. The evidence says that working families are worse off under universal credit. Actually, not because of the technocratic elements of universal credit, but because the government made a very deliberate decision to make sure that the financial crisis would be borne by those who could least afford it. And they are people who are going out to work, they are doing what's asked of them, but as hard as they try, they can't make ends meet because the odds are stacked against them and the government are not on their side. That's what people in Oldham tell me. That's what people in Oldham feel when they work very long hours and just don't see the reward of doing that.
Further to that point, would the member give way?
Of course.
Thank you, honourable member, for giving way for this early hours of the morning, or late day, early morning, whatever it may be. Would the honourable member agree that the issues he is discussing from his constituency in the United Kingdom are United Kingdom wide, and further that the report from the Central England Law Centre indicates that universal credit sanctions are 3 times that of other sanctions, is a very worrying trend, and all constituencies right across the whole of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland?
Thank you. That's a very important intervention, not least of all because when you look at the Department for Work and Pensions' own statistics on where error lies in the system, actually the error lies within the Department for Work and Pensions. In 2016-17, claimant error was 1.8%, official error was 4.9%. So people who are using the system as claimants are doing what's asked, and actually the margin of error is marginal. It's actually the official errors that are taking place that are sending people into very severe debt and poverty in many cases, and we've seen all too often to the food bank in some cases too. Yes.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I congratulate him for securing tonight's debate on a different aspect of universal credit than I think we've been really discussing before, and it's very refreshing to hear it. Does he agree with me that reports produced by the likes of Oxford and Liverpool universities on the links between sanctions, benefit sanctions and food bank use prove that there is a major issue here regarding the DWP sanction regime and forcing people into food poverty.
Hear, hear.
I mean, that's what's cruel about this. If you're working class, you're taught that if you're willing to roll your sleeves up and work hard and put the hours in, that you can get by. And if you work really hard, your son or daughter will have a better life than you had. And that you pass that legacy on to your children. I see a lot of people in Oldham who are doing what's asked of them, who are working long hours, but that prospect that they will do better than their parents and their children will do better than them is just distant. And I think that's cruel. You know, we're still one of the richest countries in the world, but we're a country that's built on very weak foundations, and I really fear for what Brexit means to our country, just how fragile our economy is, and actually how little investment's being made in the foundation of rebuilding our economy, whether we're talking about skills, the type of industry that will get us beyond Brexit, housing and public services. All those things matter, and I just don't see the investment being made in places where it ought to. I think it's a very, very sad situation. If I reflect on my own situation, when my son was first born, we relied on working families' tax credits. It helped us. It meant we weren't just eating cheap microwave meals or skipping meals entirely to pay the rent, but it also meant for the first time we were part of the welfare state. We were always taught that when you claim benefits, it was when you were absolutely in dire need of them. Not that there was a shame necessarily with it, but that they were there and they were to be treasured. And so you didn't abuse them, but when you needed them, the safety net would be there and it would catch you. That's why you pay national insurance. That's why you value them in that sense. Now, I worked for 40 hours a week, but it still wasn't enough, particularly when large bills or unexpected bills came in. And it was a hard lesson for me that, you know, it doesn't matter sometimes how hard you work. Sometimes when you get caught in a cycle of debt, that can be a cycle that traps you, and it can be very difficult to break beyond that. And it only takes one or two minor things going wrong, a household bill coming in unexpectedly, for instance, and it can be very, very difficult. I should say, though, it also showed me that sometimes the machinery of government isn't on your side. The reason why we were in debt actually wasn't because of an unexpected bill. It was because there was an error in calculating our family tax credits that sent us into an overpayment situation that they then... Yeah, I'll give way on that.
He's making a really important point, and this is an important debate worth staying in the chamber for, but it is, like his constituency, my area has been a pathfinder for universal credit for some time, and it is those bits of absurdity which I find so hard to take. Government error resulting in people being sanctioned. I've had people sanctioned for attending a job interview, which obviously they're mandated to attend. Now, you win those cases on appeal, but it takes 2 weeks, it takes 3 weeks often. The sanction means there's only the dependence on high-cost credit or food banks to get by, and the people then become trapped in a spiral of despair, frankly, and I find that bit of the system absolutely unconscionable.
And that was my experience. We were working long hours. We relied on tax credits to be able to pay the rent and put food on the table, but through no fault of our own, we were then trapped in a system that made an error and put the blame and the responsibility on our shoulders when it was a fault, eventually proven fault by the system. But the stress in families that creates, where you haven't got that disposable income to be able to satisfy the claims and demands that are coming, is very difficult. And that's the experience of people who were on universal credit, particularly, by the way, given my situation. I was in a secure job. I had a regular wage, my employment wasn't changing, my hours weren't changing all the time. I would fear being a claimant on universal credit today, whereas in insecure employment where my hours would change from 1 week to the next, where my employer wouldn't give me certainty of employment in the future, or even worse, where my employer would put me on a 0-hour or a self-employed contract and I have to declare that and declare earnings up front, just in case there's an error later down the line. That doesn't strike me as a system that's been designed for the claimant. That seems to me that it's been designed to create a culture, and actually I think a very corrosive culture, which isn't one of a safety net that's there to catch you, or a top-up benefit system that's meant to make work pay, but a culture of a deserving poor. So if you're poor, you're there and you're poor because of your own fecklessness or laziness or it's choice, not because you've been caught in a cycle of debt and despair. But also a begrudging sense of what the welfare state is meant to be, that, all right, we'll pay the money if we have to, but it's only if we really have to. And the culture that creates, I think, is very, very dangerous for a country that has that long history of a welfare state being in place. Working families, over 1 million of them, will be £2,800 worse off under universal credit. Food banks have reported a 30% increase in referrals in areas with full universal credit rollout. In Greater Manchester, and particularly in Oldham, and I want to use this as an opportunity to pay tribute to my neighbour, the member for Oldham East and Saddleworth, for the leadership that she's shown on this issue. And she'll know from her constituency the real depth of despair that people see, the problems with the system, but also actually some of these can be solved, providing government step back, listen to the concerns and take enough time to fix them instead of going on full steam ahead into a programme that we know has been built to fail. Now, as one of the first pilot authorities, we now have 4,000 claimants in Oldham and 49,000 across Greater Manchester, and nearly 20,000 of those people are in work. We've seen delays, mistakes, IT failures. On top of this, the very deliberate decision by the government to cut payments to those claimants who need it most. And that has real consequences. We've heard from the Citizens Advice Bureau, the Greater Manchester Law Centre, my own local authority, and directly from people working in job centres across Greater Manchester, as well as a wide range of charities, including the Oldham Food Bank, who have seen scores of people, often, by the way, referred by the Department for Work and Pensions themselves, queuing for food banks for food vouchers just to get a basic supply to be able to live. My casework advisors are swamped, and so are many charities. We fear the rollout to the full 322,000 legacy benefit claimants, not for ourselves, but because we see the scale of human suffering if the government continue to fail to heed the warnings of a broken system.
Will my friend give way?
Yes, good way.
Thank you very much. Does my honourable friend agree that it's particularly worrying that we're going to see the rollout of a sanctions regime to people who are already in work, and as you say that they're often in insecure work with varying hours, which will leave them liable and open to benefit sanctions for reasons beyond their control?
That's a very important issue, because we have heard concerns raised where people are underemployed, so they haven't got enough hours to make a full-time week up, and so the government require them to actively pursue work to make up the additional hours. But it could be that they're only 1 or 2 hours under the threshold, but they're still required to attend an interview. Now, if you work for an employer who has no flexibility, and by the way, we'll be happy for you to walk out the door because there's a queue of 10 people who are willing to take your 35-hour-a-week job, well, maybe you can't get to the appointment that gives you the additional hours. Maybe the employer won't give you the additional hours required to satisfy the job centre. And these are real examples of what people are going through today. In a recent survey conducted by Citizens Advice, they found that 39% of people had waited more than 6 weeks and 11% waited more than 10 weeks. We've heard a lot about the need for welfare to mirror work. Yes, it ought to provide a smooth transition between employment, changing contract terms and earnings, as well as significant changes in circumstance. But at its heart, it's a welfare state. It's a safety net. It's there to catch you when you fall in difficult times and to help you keep your head above water. It's meant to help you, not treat you as undeserving, not to treat you with suspicion and resentment. And for a safety net to work, it must be there when you fall, not to tell you to hit the ground hard and wait 6 to 10 weeks before help arrives. That's not in the spirit of a welfare state that you pay into through national insurance, that you make that contribution as an insurance policy, and then when you need it, it fails to be there. I think this is fundamental to me. There is a contract in place between citizens and the state, and the contract is this. If we collectively, by our common endeavour, pay into a national insurance contribution, then that fund ought to be there when we need it. Now, the government have failed to honour that contract, as far as I can see, and people who pay into it have the right to be disgruntled about that and to question whether it's there or not. I would like to believe that isn't what the government want, but you see the corrosive nature of the benefits debates taking place in some of our media. You hear the language that gets used by the government, and I do believe that we're now in a position where the government would be happy for public support to fall away completely from the welfare state as a reason to take the axe even further into it. And I just wonder if some of this is about, because I know in Oldham, when the banking crisis really hit, people in Oldham didn't blame the bankers. They didn't blame the government. The people they did blame were the neighbours. They were looking at the neighbours with a slightly nicer car than them and questioning why they could have the nicer car and they couldn't. They're questioning people who were getting in a taxi with their suitcases full, ready to go on holiday, and asking why they could have a holiday and they couldn't. And that's the cruelty of this. We've set people on low incomes against other people on low incomes, and the government have got away with it. At the same time, when the bankers haven't been taken to task, and corporation tax have been handed out, when at the same time the axe has been taken to the welfare state that was meant to be there to support them. We also know that 30% of people have reported making up to 10 calls to the Universal Credit helpline before their application was processed, many waiting more than 30 minutes, and up until very recently charged a very high premium to do so. 57% of people borrowed money while waiting for the first payment. So far, 101 job centres covering 14% of all job centres in Great Britain operate the Universal Credit full service. We fear for what the rollout really means, but it's more fundamental than the facts and the figures. I talked about how we pay into the pot, and that needs to be there when we support it. I could go into a lot of detail around the sanctioning regime and just how unfair, inflexible, and in a way it doesn't take into account the very real lives that people do have. I'll give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. I congratulate him on the passion and conviction which he's speaking on this hugely important issue at such an early hour in the morning. Does he share my concern of the report that was released this morning by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation that highlighted that pensioners and children in many families, as a result of benefit sanctions, were falling further into poverty, despite the fact that much progress has been made? Does he agree with me that as Brexit starts to bite and these sanctions come into place, we are approaching a catastrophe for those who are on low incomes?
That's absolutely the experience of people who have been affected, and for people actually who are far away from the job market. It's wrong that people who are in work on low wages, insecure employment, are being treated. But we ought to have a welfare state that supports people into employment. It just does not do that in the way that we want to see. It might force them into a job regardless of what the job is, regardless of the suitability of it, but it doesn't take into account the real desire for people to want to make an active contribution and to feel that their life is going somewhere. And I think that's the real cruelty of the current system. According to DWP's own data, Greater Manchester has seen a staggering 34,000 sanctions in the 12 months to June 2017, with 3,420 of those in Oldham alone, just in a 12-month period. Unsurprisingly, December saw the highest sanction rates hit its peak at 4,200. Hardly surprising given the Christmas period does knock appointments out of sync and mean that people might not be able to attend. My plea is this, and it's been a plea that's been made a number of times. If you believe in the foundation of a fair society, then you've got to have rights and obligations, but you've also got to have a state that recognises that it has a role to play too. And the role to play is this. The foundations cannot be taken for granted. When they were brought in because the country was in a state and we recognised that something dramatic had to happen to build the type of Britain we want. And the idea that those brave decisions can be undone by a government that seems completely indifferent to the human suffering that's being made is worrying. But more than that, the challenge our country faces as we embark on leaving the European Union is one of the biggest in generations. It could provide economic shock, social shock, and we don't quite know yet what the consequences are going to be. You would think, in that context, that the government would take this as an opportunity to re-establish its vision for what type of Britain is going to exist after Brexit. And core to that has got to be decent public services, a social security system that's there when people need it, and an employment system where we invest in industry and make sure that the next generation have the chance that unfortunately has been taken away from too many, which is that they can do better, get on in life and have a decent life living in this country. And the government needs to step up on this. Time is ticking, generations are passing by. I don't want it for my children, and nobody in this house should want it for their children or their constituents either.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And time is a little short, but I will seek to address as much as possible that I can of what the Honourable Gentleman's raised, and I congratulate him on securing this important debate this evening. If I may, I'd like to start by going over some of the principles why we have conditionality and how the system we've designed specifically in universal credit supports claimants in meeting it. The Honourable Gentleman himself went over some of the history of our benefit support system. And yes, absolutely, the system is there to provide a safety net, but it's also a well understood and long-standing principle that individuals must meet certain conditions to receive certain benefits. Now, it is possible, of course, to argue for a system of out-of-work support which does not have conditionality, something like a universal basic income, but that is not, to the best of my knowledge, the policy of the official opposition or other opposition parties in this House, and it would be a completely different debate. Conditionality has been a long-standing feature of welfare benefit entitlements in this country, and the scope and scale of it has evolved over time. The introduction of job seekers allowance in 1996 intensified monitoring of unemployed claimants' job-seeking behaviour, and the incoming Labour government of 1997 adopted what was called a work-first and work-for-all approach, which embraced JSA's monitoring of claimants' job search activities, backed up by benefit sanctions in cases of non-compliance. Universal credit is specifically designed so that work coaches engage with and support people early in their claim and then throughout, to give them advice and support and not to lose contact with them. With the introduction of the claimant commitment, it's clear to claimants what is expected of them. Through it, they commit to undertake certain actions, such as attending interviews, applying for jobs and apprenticeships, or going on training in exchange for receiving benefits. I'm most terribly sorry. I don't really have time to address all of what I need to in her honourable friend's remarks, and so I must, if she will. Okay then.
I was simply going to ask on the claimant commitments if the Minister believes it, if it's correct that a single parent of a 13-year-old child should have to sign up to a claimant commitment to seek work for 35 hours a week when they have a child to look after in school holidays.
The claimant commitment is something which is agreed between the individual, the claimant, and the work coach, and it's based on their particular circumstances. So if you had, for example, a mother of young children and she was taking them to school and back, then the time she would have available to work, and indeed the time she would have available for work search, would be restricted by that. If you had caring responsibilities for a spouse, a parent or a disabled child, that again is going to change the amount of time you have available. The point is that it is to be a tailored system which responds to, which reflects the individual's circumstances, and the individual and the work coach between them agree what is reasonable, and the claimant then commits to it. Work coaches do have the flexibility, as I was saying, to personalise the requirements. In fact, I pretty much covered what I was about to say in that paragraph in responding to the Honourable Lady. They can also remove all work-related requirements where it's not reasonable to expect claimants to be able to comply, or suspend them temporarily, for example, when someone needs time to find a home. We're constantly reviewing our guidance and ensuring that work coaches understand the importance of getting the right levels of conditionality in place based on the claimant's individual circumstances. Indeed, when a work coach takes up the role for the first time, they go through a minimum of 5 weeks of classroom-based learning, after which they consolidate that learning back in their job centre. This training covers conditionality and setting appropriate commitments for the specific circumstances of that claimant. Additionally, when a job centre goes live with Universal Credit full service, existing work coaches there go through 3 weeks of classroom learning, which also includes how to apply conditionality and agree reasonable commitments. Similarly, work coaches can refer to extensive guidance on how to support claimants with disabilities and complex needs. It is right that there's a system in place to encourage claimants to meet their requirements and, as a result, move closer to work. As such, if a claimant does not meet the requirements they have agreed to in their claimant commitment, they're referred to a decision maker to determine whether a sanction is appropriate. We take a number of steps to make sure our decisions are fair. The decision maker invites those referred for a sanction to explain why they failed to meet their requirements. We take the claimant's individual circumstance into account, including any health conditions or disabilities, and any evidence of good reason before making a decision to apply a sanction. Evidence from trials where there was no conditionality for the first 13 weeks did show a significant increase in the length of time spent on benefit, and this was due mainly to people taking longer to find work. In addition, over 7/10 of universal credit claimants said the potential for sanctions made them more likely to look for work or take steps to prepare for work. A report from the OECD in 2013 also noted that the UK's, and I quote, long tradition of activation policies to promote the effective reintegration into employment of working-age benefit recipients helped limit the rise in unemployment even during the global and financial crisis, unquote. Where a claimant disagrees with a sanction, they can ask the decision to be reconsidered. Following this, if necessary, they can appeal against the decision to an independent tribunal. Ultimately, where a sanction is applied, it can only deduct an amount equal to the claimant's personal element of universal credit, that is, their standard allowance. It does not apply to the additional amounts they may receive in respect of having children, to cover housing costs, or for help with the costs of disability. We also have a well-established system of hardship payments in place, and in universal credit, claimants are able to apply for a hardship payment from the time their payments are reduced through a sanction. Nevertheless, most claimants do what is expected of them and are not sanctioned. The latest published statistics show that at March 2017, 6.9% of people on universal credit had a deduction taken from their standard allowance as a result of a sanction. The rate in universal credit is higher than the sanction rate for job seekers allowance, but the two are not directly comparable. In UC, if a claimant fails to attend a work-focused interview without good reason, they can be sanctioned, whereas in JSA, if a claimant fails to attend a work-focused interview, then after 5 days without making contact, they would have their claim terminated. In the November statistics release, about 2 in every 10 adverse sanction decisions are for failing to attend, whereas under UC, this is around 7 in every 10. To repeat, it cannot be inferred from this that more people are not attending. Rather, non-attendance is often treated differently, and this is because UC is a very different benefit, covering not just the individual element, but support for children and housing costs and other elements. UC is designed to support claimants in a holistic way, ensuring we help our claimants find or progress in work, whilst ensuring that they continue to receive help with their cost and other benefits. In universal credit, we're more likely to temporarily reduce benefit, for example, where there's a complete loss of claimant contact, while we try everything possible to contact the individual. In job seekers allowance...
Order. The House now stands adjourned.